Understand.
Good morning. The committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2E and House Rule 11, the chair announces that she may postpone roll call votes. Pursuant to notice, the committee meets to consider the following measures. H.R. 2528, the STEM Opportunities Act of 2019, H.R. 36, the Combating Sexual Harassment in Science Act of 2019, H.R. 3196, the Vera Rubin Survey Telescope Designation Act, and H.R. 3153, expanding findings for federal opioid Research and Treatment Act. I want to welcome everyone to today's markup. Today we meet to mark up 4 good bipartisan bills. First, we will consider the STEM Opportunities Act, which has been a priority of mine, of course, for many years. This bill will help us address the disparity in the number of women and minorities in STEM fields. Without including all of our nation's brainpower in the fight for the 21st century competitiveness, it is unlikely that our country will remain the world leader in science and innovation. It is therefore my hope that this bill will play a major role in ensuring our country's competitiveness in the coming years. It is not enough to simply attract women to the STEM fields. We must also ensure that they stay in these fields. And the second bill in our markup addresses one of the reasons women leave the sciences in such high rates: sexual harassment. The problem of sexual harassment in the STEM fields has not been addressed in a comprehensive fashion. I hope that the Combating Sexual Harassment Act and Science Act of 2019 can play an important role in focusing federal efforts to stamp out sexual harassment in the sciences. I want to take a moment to recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Lucas, who is an original co-sponsor of both of these bills. Both he and his staff have provided very constructive input into these bills and the hearings we held on these topics. I think the bills before us today are better off because of these efforts, and I want to sincerely thank him and his staff for their work. The third bill before us today is the Vera Rubin Survey Telescope Designation Act. I'll speak more about this bill in a minute, but I think it is appropriate that on the same day our committee tries to address the issues facing women in the STEM fields, we also take a moment to recognize a woman who overcame the hurdles she faced to provide significant contributions to the field of astronomy. Finally, we will consider the expanding findings for federal opioid research and treatment act, which is offered by Ms. Wexton. The scourge of opioid addiction is one of the most serious problems facing our nation right now. It only makes sense to bring all of our resources to bear on this issue, and I think the National Science Foundation can bring unique capabilities to the fight to better understand and deal with this critical issue. I look forward to a productive markup and moving these bills very quickly to the House floor. I now recognize the ranking member to present opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this markup. Today we'll consider 4 bipartisan bills. The first is H.R. 2528, the STEM Opportunities Act of 2019. H.R. 2528 continues this committee's long bipartisan history of supporting and expanding STEM education for all. The only way we'll achieve our potential is by utilizing America's most valuable resource, our people. That means developing a diverse, STEM-capable workforce at every education level and from every background. One of the key provisions of H.R. 2528 is a requirement for more comprehensive data collection and analysis on the students, researchers, and faculty receiving federal science grants. This data will help us identify and reduce the barriers that prevent underrepresented groups from entering and advancing in STEM. It will also help us measure the success of federal STEM programs. The bill also includes a provision directing NSF to support computer science education through the existing tribal colleges and universities program. Access to computer science resources and the development of computing skills is critical in today's economy. I'm pleased to join Chairwoman Johnson in co-sponsoring this legislation, and I want to thank her and her entire staff for working with us to refine the bill for reintroduction and incorporating our feedback and ideas. I look forward to continuing to work with the Chairwoman and members of the committee to advance more STEM education efforts this Congress to support, encourage, and develop the next generation of STEM students. Our second bill this morning is H.R. 36, the Combating Sexual Harassment in Science Act of 2019. Chairwoman Johnson and I made this one of our highest priorities, introducing it on the first day of the 116th Congress. This bill has a foundation of more than a year of investigation, analysis, and recommendations to the Science Committee. Engaging more women in STEM studies and careers is essential to American competitiveness. Women make up half the workforce, but account for less than 25% of America's STEM workforce. Unfortunately, too many women have been driven out of STEM careers due to a culture of harassment and abuse. H.R. 36 takes the first steps to addressing this problem. The bill supports the adoption of uniform guidance across the federal science agencies to reduce the prevalence of sexual harassment involving grant personnel. The bill also directs the NSF to conduct further research into the causes and consequences of harassment, as well as interventions to mitigate the problem. There is an established legal process in place within higher education and in the workplace for handling claims of sexual harassment. This bill does not alter that process. What this bill does do is create a uniform policy for universities and research institutions report to federal science agencies when an administrative action is taken that impacts the ability of a researcher to carry out a grant. We want to ensure the safety of all grant personnel supported by taxpayer funding. I'll be offering an amendment later in the markup that we hope makes this requirement even more clear. Again, thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for working in a bipartisan and collaborative way to move this legislation forward. Next, we'll consider H.R. 3196, the Vera Rubin Survey Telescope Designation Act, sponsored by Chairwoman Johnson and Representative Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon. This bill honors the contributions of the late Dr. Vera Rubin, an astronomer who made groundbreaking discoveries in the field of dark matter and was a pioneer and lifelong advocate for women in astronomy. This new LSST telescope under construction in Chile, funded by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy, will photograph the entire sky every few nights. One of the goals of the project is to study the nature of dark matter and dark energy. Naming the observatory in her honor is a fitting tribute to the contributions to the field, and her contributions to the field, I should note, and I hope this will inspire future generations of women in astronomy. Finally, the committee will consider H.R. 3153, the Expanding Findings for Federal Opioid Research and Treatment Act. This legislation identifies current gaps that exist in research on the prevention and treatment of opioid addiction and authorizes the NSF to support research grants in those areas. And I want to thank Representative Jennifer Wexton and Representative Jim Baird for their bipartisan work on this bill. Opioid addiction affects too many in our communities, and I applaud this effort to support more basic research on the science of addiction. Once again, thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding today's markup, and I encourage the members of the committee to support all these bills. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. We will now consider H.R. 2528, the STEM Opportunities Act of 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2528, a bill to direct the director.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself for a comment on the bill. For decades, the scientific enterprise has been the very envy of the world. Our success has been driven by investments in people, in STEM students, in blue-collar STEM workers, and in scientists and engineers. We've managed so far with a STEM workforce does not represent the diversity of the nation. However, we cannot afford to rest on our laurels. With intensifying global competition and urgent environmental, societal, and technological challenges before us, we must do more to ensure that we're bringing all of our brain power and talent to bear. Unfortunately, research shows that discrimination, harassment, bias, hostile work cultures, and institutional barriers are pushing scores of talented people to abandon their STEM studies and careers. I'm pleased to be joined by my good friend, Ranking Member Lucas, earlier this year as introducing H.R. 2528, the STEM Opportunities Act of 2019. The STEM Opportunities Act supports research, data collection, and evidence-based interventions to identify and lower barriers to the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women and underrepresented minorities in STEM education and research careers. The bill also directs the Office of Science and Technology Policy excuse me, to develop consistent guidelines for federal science agencies on providing caregiving accommodations, thank you, reducing the impact of implicit bias, and best practices for assessing organizational culture. In 2017, the National Academies published a report, Beyond Bias and Barriers, Fulfilling the Potential of Women in Academic Science and Engineering. The recommendations in that report became the basis for the very first version of this bill. Today's bill includes many updates and improvements based on the recommendations we have received since that time. If we are to lead the world in meeting the challenges of the 21st century, we need all of our brightest minds at the table. This can only happen with meaningful and lasting cultural change. H.R. 2528 is an important step in that direction, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Ms. Bonamici.
Chairwoman Johnson, thank you. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Our committee's work today is an important step to address the underrepresentation of women and people of color in STEM fields, and I strongly support the STEM Opportunities Act. I'm grateful to Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas for their leadership on this bill. The STEM Opportunities Act would improve our understanding of the persistent biases and barriers that exist for increasing the diversity of the STEM workforce. The bill would direct federal science agencies to collect comprehensive demographic data on the recipients of federal research awards and STEM faculty at universities. It would require the Office of Science and Technology Policy to develop federal guidelines to improve the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women in underrepresented populations in STEM research careers. But the development and diversification of the STEM pipeline must begin in our nation's K-12 schools. As a member of the Education and Labor Committee and the founder and co-chair of the Congressional STEAM Caucus, I continue to advocate for the integration of art and design into STEM fields. STEAM education can build more inclusive classroom environments that support greater diversity of students interested in STEM, especially girls and people of color. STEAM education recognizes the benefits of both the arts and sciences and their intersections to our country's future. Our future will require innovation, creative ideas, and new ways to solve problems, all of which are bolstered by educating the whole brain. And research shows that students are more engaged in the classroom when arts, music, and other creative outlets are included in instruction. There are 2 nationally recognized STEAM schools in the district I represent in Northwest Oregon, and I have seen firsthand the power of these programs to engage all students in STEM. Earlier this week, I introduced the Bipartisan Building STEAM Education Act of 2019 with Representatives Langevin and Stefanik to expand resources and grant opportunities that support STEAM education programs. Notably, this bill would require the STEM Education Advisory Panel, which brings together leaders from the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, NASA, and NOAA to consider ways to integrate art and design into STEM education programs. It would also promote creativity and innovation by expanding resources through the National Science Foundation's Mathematics and Science Education Partnership Grant Program to include the development of STEM education curricula that incorporate art and design. I hope that in addition to advancing the STEM Opportunities Act, I can work with the chairwoman, ranking member, and my colleagues on this committee to make sure that all students, including girls and students of color, have the creative and critical thinking skills they will need to solve 21st century problems through increased STEAM education. I thank the chairwoman for the time and her leadership on this important issue. I urge my colleagues to support the STEM Opportunities Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments? We now will proceed with the amendments in the order on the roster. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chair, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment in the nature
I
of...
ask unanimous consent to dispense of the reading, and without objection so ordered. I recognize myself to explain the amendment. Excuse me, this voice. The amendment includes clarifying and technical changes, including changes to reflect feedback from federal and non-federal stakeholders. I urge support of this amendment. Are there any other?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. This amendment strikes and replaces the text of H.R. 2528 to incorporate stakeholder and agency feedback in the bill. This amendment was drafted in a bipartisan way, includes a number of improvements to the original draft. Among the changes, the amendment incorporates feedback from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is consistent with the administration's 5-year strategic plan that specifically calls for an increase of diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM programs. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments or any other amendments? Then we will proceed with the next amendment and vote on my amendment after it has been amended. Mr. Lipinski.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 2, offered
I
by...
ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading and without objection so ordered. I recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I applaud your leadership to make opportunities in STEM more accessible to those from underrepresented groups. I think the work in this bill would make great strides towards improving diversity in the STEM workforce, especially in academia. I want STEM careers to be accessible to all, and my amendment would explicitly include in this bill postdoctoral researchers as trainees who would benefit from mentoring and encouragement to pursue academic careers. Postdoctoral researchers are important to our universities and the greater research enterprise. These scholars hold doctoral degrees and engage in mentored research or scholarly training as a means of professional development, often to learn a new skill or gain more experience before moving on to more permanent positions. In addition to broadening or deepening their own skill set, postdoctoral researchers often serve as mentors and day-to-day supervisors to graduate and undergraduate students. This unique place in the research environment makes postdoc researchers both mentees and mentors. The quality of mentoring that postdocs receive heavily influences their career choices, and it's important that faculty and senior researchers are prepared to mentor postdoctoral researchers. We can probably all agree that the mentoring of graduate students is fundamentally different from mentoring undergraduate students, as these populations have different needs. Similarly, the mentoring of postdoctoral researchers requires attention to different details, and these researchers are simultaneously colleagues and trainees. By explicitly mentioning postdoctoral researchers as proposed in my amendment, we will ensure that the mentoring workshop programs as funded by the National Science Foundation may include best practices in the mentoring of postdoctoral researchers. I'm also glad to see that this bill would encourage undergraduate and graduate students from underrepresented groups to consider academic careers. I believe that we should also encourage our postdoctoral researchers from underrepresented groups to pursue academic careers. My amendment also makes a provision explicit in the bill such that funds from the National Science Foundation may be used for this purpose. Madam Chair, I asked for my colleagues' support for this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Now we'll have the vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Are there any other amendments? If not, the vote occurs on the chair's amendment in the nature of the substitute. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 2528 as amendment to the House and with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion may signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably considered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table, and I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objections so ordered, members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplementary, minority, or additional views on this measure. We now will move to H.R. 36, the Combating of Sexual Harassment in Science Act for 2019. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 36, a bill to provide for research to better understand the causes and consequences of sexual harassment.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself to comment on this bill. Sexual harassment has consequences for the well-being and the careers of women in every sector and every walk of life. In the sciences, it drives women out of the lab and field sites, conferences, and classrooms, cutting their careers short and depriving the scientific enterprise of their skills and intellect. While women have made progress in terms of their representation in some STEM fields, they continue to be significantly underrepresented in other fields. Over the past couple of years, this committee has examined these issues through bipartisan investigation and 2 hearings. We have learned about harassers who have escaped scrutiny or avoided disciplinary action for their toxic behavior for years, or have succeeded in transferring to other universities with little or no record of their misdeeds. Grant-making agencies have learned of many of these cases themselves through the press. We've discussed with the experts and stakeholders steps that can be taken now to address the lack of accountability. We've also considered what additional research is needed to improve the understanding of the cultural factors enabling harassment in the sciences and to develop policies and interventions that will help change that culture. We looked carefully at the recommendations in the 2018 National Academy's report on sexual harassment in the sciences. This work has culminated in the bipartisan bill before us today. This bill supports data collection and research into the factors and consequences of sexual harassment in academia. It requires policies among federal science agencies for reporting of sexual harassment cases involving university personnel supported by federal research grants. While the bill requires coordination and encourages uniformity in policies across the agencies, it also accommodates the unique circumstances of each science agency. We worked very closely with representatives from the university community as well to address their concerns in the bill before us. H.R. 36 has received 26 endorsements, including from the Association for Women in Science, the Association of Women in Mathematics, and the Society of Women Engineers, along with many of the largest scientific societies. I want to thank Ranking Member Lucas for partnering with me for this bill, and the committee staff on both sides of the aisle for working on a bipartisan basis with the stakeholders to understand and address their concerns. H.R. 36 is an important step in tackling the serious issue of sexual harassment in the sciences, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Does anyone else need to be recognized? We are now open for, oh, Ms. Bonamichin, sorry.
I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. Thank you for holding today's markup on this important legislation. Historically, the diversity of our science and technology workforce has not been inclusive of women and people of color, and the persistent biases and inequities in our STEM workforce limit which problems we identify and how we address them. And I'm glad we've spent a significant portion of time in this committee discussing ways to improve the diversity of our STEM workforce and continue to have these conversations with my colleagues on the Education and Labor Committee as well. But as we heard from our witnesses during this committee's May 9th hearing on this issue, the prevalence of harassment in the sciences often undermines career advancement for women in STEM fields. According to a June 2018 National Academies report, 58% of women in academia experience sexual harassment, which is unacceptable. We have a responsibility to do everything we can to make sure that scientists and researchers can work without fear of harassment or retaliation. This starts with prevention and making sure survivors can seek justice. I strongly support the Combating Sexual Harassment in Science Act, which would direct federal science agencies to implement policy changes to address sexual harassment. The bill will implement the major recommendations from the National Academies by improving transparency in the reporting process, providing support to survivors, and updating ethics codes to treat harassment with the same scrutiny as scientific misconduct. Importantly, the bill would direct the Office of Science and Technology to establish sexual harassment policy guidelines for agencies awarding extramural research grants. As we heard during the hearing on this bill, a single entity is needed to help establish a consistent sexual harassment policy across the federal government. Regardless of the occupation, everyone should be able to work in a safe and welcoming workplace. This bill is an important first step in the greater need to address harassment in the science workforce, and I thank Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas for their leadership on this bill. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Anyone else seeking recognition? We will now proceed with the amendments in the order that's on the roster. The first amendment on the roster is an amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chair, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 1, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 36.
I ask unanimous consent to dispose of the reading, and without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. Changes in the amendment reflects input from key stakeholders at federal science agencies within the committee's jurisdiction, as well as with leaders of the scientific societies and higher education associations. While the scope of the intent of the bill remained the same, the amendment includes clarifying language to address key privacy and due process concerns of the university community. These changes include definitions of key terms and language to ensure that the privacy of victims and those accused of sexual harassment is protected. The amendment also makes clear that agencies should be notified of the found conclusion of any investigation of sexual harassment, including those that find no harassment occurred. Committee staff worked closely with stakeholders in the higher education community to address concerns about unintended consequences while ensuring that the bill will drive meaningful and lasting cultural change. I urge support of this amendment. Is there any further discussion on this amendment?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. This amendment strikes and replaces the text of H.R. 36 to incorporate stakeholder and makes some technical corrections to the underlying bill. Among the changes, the amendment includes additional language ensuring privacy and due process for the victims and the accused, and making sure the bill does not conflict with any current federal laws. I appreciate that this amendment and the clarifying and technical amendment that I will offer next were developed in a bipartisan collaborative process. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. I have an amendment at the desk. Oops. Oh, the next amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the ranking member, Mr. Lucas, and you're recognized.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk. Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. My amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Correct.
Amendment number 2, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 36, offered by
I
Mr.
ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading and without objection. Mr. Lucas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. My amendment makes a couple of minor technical corrections and one important clarification to address a concern expressed by some universities. As previously discussed, the bill requires a new uniform policy for institutions to report to affected federal science agencies when an administrative action has been taken against grant personnel in cases of sexual or gender harassment. My amendment clarifies the trigger for that reporting to administrative actions that affects the ability of the grant personnel or their trainees to carry out the activities of the grant. I believe this is an appropriate trigger, and this language helps to provide clarity to universities about their new responsibilities. I thank Chairwoman Johnson and her staff for working closely with us and stakeholders on this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. I support this amendment. Is there any further discussion on it? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted, agreed to. Further
Madam-
proceedings,
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 3, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 36,
I ask unanimous consent to dispense of the reading, and without objection, I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm grateful to you and Ranking Member Lucas for introducing this important bipartisan legislation and for your leadership on this issue. My amendment is a simple addition to the effort to coordinate federal science agency efforts to reduce the prevalence of sexual and gender harassment and develop policy guidance addressing it. Our committee has heard testimony in multiple hearings about many barriers to re-entry into the workforce for those who have experienced harassment, and we can address this issue in this legislation. Based on the information we learned at the hearing, I offer this amendment that will direct the Office of Science and Technology to consider developing policy guidelines that also require agencies and grantees to have mechanisms for reintegration of individuals who've experienced sexual harassment and gender harassment. I believe that this is an important and necessary step in making sure that those who experience harassment are able to re-enter the workforce, and I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. I support this amendment. Is there any further discussion on it? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? If not, then the vote occurs on the chair's amendment in nature of a substitute. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. A reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 36 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. We have now 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplementary minority or additional views on the measure. We now move to H.R. 3196 for consideration. The Vera Rubin Survey Telescope Designation Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3196, a bill to designate the large.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself for comments. Dr. Vera Rubin was a renowned astronomer and a staunch advocate for women in science. Captivated by the sight of stars drifting across the night sky outside her bedroom window, her excitement for science was sparked at a young age. Dr. Rubin persisted despite facing barriers because of her gender throughout her career. She was also a fierce advocate for expanding opportunities for girls in STEM. She advocated for more women members of the National Academy of Sciences and more women on the review panels and academic research committees. In 1970, Dr. Rubin published some of the best evidence of the existence of dark matter. This groundbreaking work helped to change the conventional view of the universe from one dominated by light-emitting matter to one dominated by dark matter. Dr. Rubin went on to become the second woman astronomer elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1981. She received the National Medal of Science in 1983. The Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, the LSST, set to begin operations in 2023, will build on Dr. Rubin's legacy in advancing our understanding of dark matter. Funded jointly by the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, LSST will survey the entire southern sky every 3 days. Among other scientific goals, this data will enable astronomers to probe the nature of dark matter. I cannot think of a more fitting tribute to Vera Rubin's legacy than to designate the LSST as the Vera Rubin Survey Telescope. I want to thank my colleagues from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez Colon, for joining me in introducing H.R. 3196, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Are there anyone wishing to be recognized? Chair recognized. Yeah, recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I really thank you for allowing this bill to go to markup today and for allowing me to be a co-lead on this bill. I think it's important. I want to thank also Ranking Member Lucas for holding this markup today with very important bills. I am a proud co-lead, as I just said, of H.R. 3196, the Vera Rubin Survey Telescope Designation Act, alongside the Chairwoman Johnson. As the Chair just said, Dr. Rubin encountered many obstacles during her academic and professional career. As a student, her application to Princeton University was denied because at the time, women were not allowed to enroll in astrophysics graduate program of this institution. Similarly, years later, she had problems accessing the Palomar Observatory in California, one of the most iconic scientific facilities in the world, also because she was a woman. Experience such as this will be enough to discourage anyone to pursue studies in STEM and to discourage a young student and a scientist. Still, Dr. Rubin persevered, demonstrating exceptional intellectual capabilities and character. Dr. Vera Rubin changed the way we understand the universe today. Her groundbreaking work on dark matter and galaxy rotations remain at the forefront of the STEM research in the field of astronomy. Her legacy will undoubtedly continue to influence future generations of scientists and will hopefully be memorialized in a new large Synoptic Survey Telescope in Chile. This telescope, it's currently on track to begin operations in 2023, jointly funded by the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and private funding raised by the telescope. This telescope will soon be utilized by scientists to conduct a wide range of studies, including the nature of dark matter and dark energy, the fields of Dr. Vera Rubin. I am very much looking forward to the great work of this facility will produce by research, actually like Dr. Rubin. I would like to conclude saying how grateful I am to be part of this legislation and this committee. We need to find bipartisan solutions to encourage women and minorities to become and remain interested in careers in STEM. I believe highlighting the sacrifice, their contributions, is one of the many ways we can continue to do so. I would like to thank Chairman Johnson once more and commend the leadership of this committee. As someone with a STEM background and a representative of many young girls and women who are either pursuing or interested in pursuing a career in STEM, I think this will encourage their work to be noticed. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Are there others who wish to be recognized? If not, a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3196 to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplementary, minority, or additional views on the measure. Now we'll take up H.R. 3153 for consideration. The Expanding Findings of Federal Opioid Research and Treatment Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3153, a bill.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And I recognize Ms. Wexton, the bill sponsor, to make any comments on the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am so pleased to be a part of the bipartisan work that takes place in this committee, and I thank many of my colleagues across the aisle for supporting this important legislation. The opioid epidemic has taken a heartbreaking toll on families across America, including many in my state of Virginia. Tens of thousands of Americans and over 1,000 Virginians are dying every year from overdoses. Since 2014, overdose fatalities have surpassed deaths from motor vehicle crashes and firearms as the top cause of unnatural deaths in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's only gone up since that time. Addiction is an illness, and fighting this crisis effectively requires adequate research and funding. The National Science Foundation has done an exceptional job in establishing some of the foundational understanding for the translational and clinical research on opioid addiction, including research regarding the neuroscience of addiction, opioid abuse intervention, and the secondary effect on families and options for alternative therapies for pain. While this research has significantly increased the nation's understanding of opioid addiction, research gaps remain in a wide range of disciplines, including social and behavioral issues such as stigma, socioeconomic status, or accessibility to treatment. The NSF has a unique strength in being able to help us close some of these gaps and, in turn, help us to develop solutions. My legislation, the Expanding Findings for Federal Opioid Research and Treatment, or EFFORT Act, will work to do this by directing the NSF to support and conduct multidisciplinary research on opioid addiction. Both the NSF and NIH have recognized that research efforts would benefit greatly from this multidisciplinary approach. By expanding the NSF's research on opioid addiction, both within its agency as well as jointly with NIH when needed, we can effectively integrate clinical and basic research, obtain a broader understanding of opioid addiction and its impacts, equip health professionals with new tools to stop the cycle of addiction, and establish a more comprehensive effort against this crisis. As one of the founding members of the Bipartisan Freshman Working Group on Addiction, I have worked to be a strong advocate for addiction prevention and recovery efforts, and I am pleased to have introduced this legislation with my fellow freshman colleague, Congressman Baird. It's important that we work to better capture the severity of opioid addiction, and expanding federal research will help us to do just that. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Weston. Anyone else needs to be recognized? Mr. Baird first, and then Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Lucas. We appreciate you having this markup on House Resolution 3153. You know, the opioid crisis has tragically destroyed the lives of many Hoosiers. According to the most recent available data from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, in 2017, drug overdose deaths in Indiana increased by 22.5% from the previous year. Indiana's 2017 rate of overdose deaths at just over 29 people per 100,000 was significantly higher than the national average of just over 21 per 100,000. This epidemic does not discriminate, and we must use evidence-based policy to ensure the health and well-being of current and future generations. The National Science Foundation's research has increased what we know about addiction, and while this research is at the top of its class, there are still gaps that remain in the prevention and treatment of opioid addiction. That's why I joined my colleague, Congresswoman Wexton, to introduce this Effort Act, directing the National Science Foundation in consultation with the National Institutes of Health to support merit-reviewed and competitively awarded research on the science of opioid addiction. By expanding basic research, we can promote great collaboration and further understand how we better treat the multiple aspects of the opioid addiction. I hope we can see an end to this crisis soon, and I am proud that Congress is taking action to fight back. And I ask my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wishing to be recognized? Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member, for holding this important markup. And I'm pleased to see this committee again move bipartisan bills to the House floor. I also want to thank my colleagues, Congresswoman Wexton and Congressman Baird, for their leadership to introduce legislation that prioritizes research on the prevention and treatment of opiate addiction. We cannot do enough to help those families suffering from the terrible consequences of this scourge. The opioid epidemic has ravaged entire communities in my home state of Ohio. According to CDC data, 5 counties with the highest per capita of fentanyl-related overdose deaths are in the state of Ohio. Additionally, the CDC estimates the total economic burden of prescription opioid misuse alone in our country is $78.5 billion a year. That's why I'm pleased to support this legislation that will require the NSF and NIH to support merit-reviewed and competitively awarded research on the science of opioid addiction. Furthering research on improving prevention and treatment for addiction will help our communities confront this horrific epidemic in a more holistic way. I strongly encourage my colleagues to support the expanding findings for Federal Opioid Research and Treatment Act and provide much-needed research on opioid addiction impacting many of our communities. With that, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Any further comments? Hearing none. Are there any amendments? If not, then a reporting quorum being present, I move that the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology report H.R. 3153 to the House with the recommendation that the bill be approved. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table, and I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Members have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplementary minority or additional views on this measure. Let me just say before we adjourn that I want to thank all of the staff on both sides of the aisle and all the members for the great input that has brought us to marking up these bipartisan bills, and I hope that that participation will continue. Input is important from everyone, and I appreciate your participation. And I thank you for attending, and that concludes our markup for the day, and the committee is adjourned.